Alrighty, hello and welcome or welcome back to the NNP Symposium. This is our 5th symposium and we are off to a great start today. We'll be here all the way through this evening and then tomorrow and Saturday as well. Jeff, you can go ahead and start your camera and microphone whenever you're ready. So for this presentation, we'll be hearing from Jeff Rock about some British Conder tokens, which is something that I know very little about, so I'm very interested to learn something new. Jeff is the president of the Conder Token Collectors Club and has been collecting Conder tokens for 25 years, so quite a bit of knowledge on the subject. Before we get into that, just a couple reminders. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so you're welcome to send in questions at any point. We'll get to them after the presentation. When you are ready to do that, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, it'll pop up a box where you can type them in. We will not be reading off names, so anything that is asked will be anonymous. And then also, we'd just like to thank the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society, or EPNIS, for fully funding the symposium and making it free to everyone who participates. So I believe that's all I have. Jeff, I will let you take it away, and I'll be back at the end for the Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you. So as Leanna mentioned, I'm president of the Conder Token Collectors Club, and that's a US-based organization devoted to the series. And it might seem strange that an organization for British token series would be based in the US, but while for most of the last half century or so, the Conder tokens have been even more popular with Americans than with the Brits. And there are reasons for this that will be discussed a little bit later in this talk. As the title states, this is an introduction to this fascinating series. So I'll assume, very little or actual knowledge by those of you listening now or at some future date. I'll give a brief introduction to the series as a whole, explain why they were made, why American collectors are fascinated with them, and then explore some of the very many different ways you can collect Conder tokens, along with lots of pretty pictures of tokens. So let's start first with that name. And there we go. So Conder tokens. First off, they're not condor tokens like this bird, but rather Conder tokens like this. This is James Conder. He lived from 1761 to 1823. He wrote a very well-regarded book on the series, literally as these tokens were still being minted. And he even issued a few tokens himself, as can be seen here. It isn't clear why the series got named after him, though. His book was neither the first one written nor the best, and the output of his own tokens was relatively small. More properly, these are called 18th century provincial tokens, but the Conder name has stuck to the series, at least in America. The club is named after Conder. The journal we issue is called the Conder Token Collectors Journal, and there's an active Facebook group devoted to this series called the Conder Cafe. At this point, the name may just be grandfathered in. There's an interesting side note to James Conder as a numismatist. He lived in a house in Suffolk for most of his life, and it was demolished 40 years after his death. When they demolished it, a hoard of 150 silver Anglo-Saxon pennies of Ethelred the Unready were buried somewhere around the year 980, literally under his doorstep. So close, but yet so far. So the Conder token series is a huge one. It dwarfs any American coin or token series of the 18th and early 19th centuries. There are over 9,000 different varieties of them if you include the edge variations. It wouldn't be until the Civil War token series in the early 1860s that the US had an issue as formidably large and complex. And like the Civil War tokens, Condors were collected as they were being made. Collectors were forming collections that not only preserved numerous specimens in nice condition, but researched them, preserved important historical documents and details, and fueled collectors' interest ever since. Indeed, there has never been an era when the 18th century Conder tokens were not popular. To understand why so many tokens were issued in just a dozen or so years, we have to take a brief look at the coinage in circulation in England, and to a lesser extent, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland during the last quarter of the 18th century. The majority of the population of these countries would fit into the poor, lower middle, and middle classes. For these groups, most of their daily needs would be priced in pence or fractions thereof. Copper halfpence and farthings were the official small change. The penny and two-penny denomination did not yet exist as a struck coin. But these coppers were never issued in a supply that would be large enough to take care of the needs of London, let alone the rest of the United Kingdom. By the 1780s, the earlier copper coins of William III, George I, and George II would be somewhere between 30 and 100 years old, and not seen in circulation too very frequently. George III copper coinage did not start until after a decade after he assumed the throne, and the English issues lasted just 6 years, from 1770 to 1775 inclusive. Up top is a regal George III halfpenny and a farthing. About 46,000 pounds, British pounds, were struck in that period. At 240 pence to the pound, this equates to a bit more than 11 million pence worth of copper. And while exact mintage figures are not available, if the total was roughly 3/4 of the halfpenny denomination, 1/4 of the farthing, that would mean close to 17 million halfpence and 11 million farthings coined in this half dozen years. And that certainly seems like a sizable number at first glance. But the population of England and Wales alone was about 7.5 million people at the time, and 1 million of them lived in London. So that equates to just under 4 regal George III copper coins per person by the time they were last coined in 1775. Ireland's coinage started earlier and went a bit later than the British coppers, and were issued also for just 6 or maybe 7 years. Mintage figures for those are unknown, but they're likely significantly less than the British copper coinage totals. Neither Scotland nor Wales had their own coinage and would have used whatever British and Irish coppers came their way, further diminishing the supply for each person. And this lack of small change caused great hardships. The poor would seldom have had much silver, would have never seen a gold coin, and most of their purchases would be in copper. Merchants needed copper to make change. So, for example, in 1780, a 4-pound loaf of bread cost 7 pence. A pound of butter would be about the same, a pound of cheese about 4 pence. And while a barrel of beer would kind of be pricey at 7 shillings, you could get a quart for about 4 pence, or, as it was always popularly said, enough gin to get drunk for just a penny. Though of small value, much of England ran on copper coinage. The void was filled, predictably, with counterfeits of varying quality, ranging from well-made and nearly full-weight pieces like this one, which were still profitable, to laughably crude coins at less than half the regal weight, which were even more profitable. Officials mostly turned a blind eye to these counterfeits since they were needed in commerce. But when the supply got too large or too blatantly lightweight, there were predictable protests from merchants who would periodically refuse to accept counterfeits in trade or do so only at a greatly reduced value. In either instance, it would be the poor who suffered the most because this was all the coins they had. Wages for most workers of this time would normally be paid in copper or very low denomination silver coinage. While copper was absent due to the small coinage figures, silver was also difficult to come by, but for a different reason. England officially undervalued silver in relation to gold compared to the rest of Europe. This meant that each silver coin struck by the Tower Mint was worth slightly more melted down than its face value. The difference was minor at the individual coin level, but in mass quantity, it became quite profitable. Newly minted silver would be bought with overvalued gold and melted about as fast as the mint could strike them. Without copper or silver coinage, how would businesses pay their employees? This was especially problematic at the start of the Industrial Revolution, where manufacturers had large numbers of workers to pay. IOUs or paper promissory notes could be issued, but these could be easily forged and might not be accepted by merchants or landlords. Another way was to pay a group of workers with a single gold coin or a larger denomination piece of paper money and let them sort it out for themselves. However, There were no bank branches around to make change, and no merchants would give up their meager supply of copper coin to do so. One of the few businesses that did have large amounts of small coins were pubs, whose wares were generally priced at no more than a few pence. But a pub wouldn't just make change. The group of workers would need to buy a round of drinks. And anyone who has ever been to England knows that in their entire history, no Brit has ever been content with just a single pint. So another round would likely be bought, and perhaps another. The predictable result was that when the bill was settled, there was very little of that original coin or note to be divided amongst the workers. An added bonus for the pub owner was that by this time, the workers' eyes and judgment were likely impaired enough that they wouldn't notice that the copper they were given in change consisted mostly of counterfeits. So regal and silver and gold coinage were both highly regulated and were meant to contain the coin's value in precious metals minus a very small amount that paid for the cost of assaying and coining. Copper coinage, at least until the advent of the Soho mint pieces very late in the 18th century, never contained their full value of copper, which meant that the government actually made a profit on each and every copper coin they struck, which makes it more amazing that they didn't make more of them. But while silver and gold prices were relatively fixed on the world market, the price of copper swung dramatically as old sources were depleted or new mines were found. For anyone who watched the BBC series Poldark, you know that the mines at Cornwall turned out a huge amount of copper, which initially depressed prices for the metal, and then they were further depressed when an even larger amount of ore was found off of Wales on the island of Anglesey. Cheap copper was a boon to manufacturers, but not to mine owners or their workers, and many mines closed, with miners forced to leave the country and search for work elsewhere, including immigrating to the US, where they had the experience to work the coal mines. So the Cornwall and Anglesey mines tried to shore up their prices by controlling their own product from start to finish. They would mine it, they would smelt it, roll it out into sheets or cast it into ingots, and bring it into market at consistent prices that allow them to make a small profit. But the inevitable interplay of supply and demand meant that as more copper was mined, prices fell, and the mine owners were left with a large amount of copper that they could not bring to market for the price they wanted. On the island of Anglesey, the two divergent streams here discussed, the want of small change and an oversupply of copper, met. This is Anglesey at the time the mines were being formed. This is sadly what it looks like today when all the copper has been ripped out of the land. The Anglesey mine had to pay its workers, but like every business, they had no ready coin to do so. But they had a mountain of copper ore. They had the machinery to smelt it and roll it into sheets. They had workers who could build or refashion rudimentary presses that could cut those sheets into round discs and stamp them with a design, making not a lightweight counterfeit coin, but initially a token that contained its full value in copper and which could be exchanged for silver or gold coin at face value. This was the birth of the Conder Token series, with the famous and lovely Druid pennies and half pennies, first struck in 1787, more struck in 1788. This was an elegant solution to the problem, and because their tokens actually weighed significantly more than the regal British halfpence and had guaranteed redemption at face value, they were readily accepted by merchants, not just on the island of Anglesey, but throughout Wales and past the Welsh borders into England as well. So accepted were these Druid tokens that at least 300 tons of them were struck, over 12 million individual tokens. The issue of these tokens was reported in the press at the time, and this caught the eye of collectors who clamored to get examples. Combining the authorized issues, contemporary counterfeits, patterns, and tokens made specifically for collectors, including mules and different edges, there are well over 500 individual die varieties of just the Anglesey issues known. The success of these Anglesey tokens led directly to the tokens being issued by other mining and metal businesses, which also needed to pay their employees. These include the Charles Rowe halfpence for the Macclesfield Copper Works in Cheshire, which began in 1789, the John Wilkinson Iron Master tokens, first struck in 1787, the KMAC issues for the Hibernian Mine Company in Dublin, which were first issued in 1792, and the Crowbane Wicklow halfpennies issued for the Associated Irish Mine Company starting in 1789. These larger series were also avidly sought by contemporary collectors, though the British issues were more popular than the Irish ones. While each of these tokens was a boon to their locality, providing a much needed circulating coinage, none of these were actually struck at the same weight levels of those Anglesey Druid tokens. This provided the issuer with a small profit on each token that was circulated, but not later redeemed. Given that the public was long used to regal copper coins not containing their full face value, and counterfeits even less so, these lighter weight tokens did not affect their circulation at all. But the issuers of these tokens were not the only ones making a profit. The token makers also made money. While the Anglesey mines initially struck their own tokens, it was not their primary business interest, and within a few years, they had outsourced some of their production to Matthew Bolton at the Soho Mint. The Cheshire pieces here were minted by John Hancock and John Westwood. The Wilkinson tokens were struck by Hancock, Westwood, and Bolton in different years. The KMAC issues were struck likely in Ireland by William Mossop, and the Crowbane pieces, even though they were meant for Ireland, were struck in England by John Hancock. While these manufacturers were making a fair amount of money from these orders, it's not surprising that others soon joined the token-making game. This was easy enough to do in major cities like London and Birmingham, where minting equipment could be easily procured, planchets could be made, and there were engravers available to make the dies. Some of this new group of token makers, like John and Paul Skidmore in London and William Lutwidge in Birmingham, issued staggering amounts of tokens, some real, some counterfeit, some made specifically for collectors who were eagerly adding new varieties to their cabinets. As with any type of manufacturer, minters needed to keep producing their product in order to keep making money. So they likely had the equivalent of sales reps farmed out across the British Isles, samples of their tokens in hand, trying to persuade merchants or other people to have their own tokens struck. Along with adding to their revenue stream and alleviating the problem of making change, tokens for these small businesses also offered free advertising with your name, profession, and address all possible on your own token. Once one merchant in a town signed up for a token, it was also often easy enough to get others to do the same, just to make sure that the competition didn't get a leg up on you. In all, at least 250 different people and firms with at least 2 female token issuers issued legitimate trade tokens. Legitimate trade tokens are those struck specifically for a person or business with a promise to redeem them. For those with known mintage figures or weights coined, there were at least 36 million token issues. And as some of the unknown numbers are from larger series like the KMAC and Wicklow pieces shown here at the bottom, the total is probably well over 40 million tokens, far more than the regal copper halfpence and farthings issued by George III to this point. For this group of legitimate trade tokens, individual orders ran from a few thousand tokens to well over 1 million tokens for some of the larger issues, and as noted, the Anglesey pennies and halfpennies accounted for 12 million of those. A goodly number of these tokens would have been redeemed by the merchants that issued them, but far from all of them. Some got lost, some, like the heavier Anglesey pieces, may have been melted down when copper prices rose. Some may have been defaced enough in circulation that a merchant might refuse to redeem them. Others were issued by firms that went out of business and thus couldn't redeem tokens. And of course, many of them found their way into collectors' cabinets. But these genuine trade tokens are just a fraction of the total number of Conder tokens that were made. There are counterfeits of most of the larger series and some of the smaller series as well. There were general trade tokens that were sold in bulk to those who could not afford to make their own tokens, which had no promise of redemption or usually gave no name or place to redeem them. As collector interest in this series grew, there were a large number of pieces made specifically for them, including pieces of a political nature, more medallic in design. There may have been off-metal strikes and mules of dies that were never intended to go together, all of which will be discussed and illustrated later. The mintage for these varied pieces is mostly unknown, but certainly dwarfs the 40 million genuine trade tokens and is likely multiples of that total. The 9,000 or so different varieties seem like an enormous figure to American collectors, where series like Early Date Large Cents have around 300 varieties, and the state coinage of Connecticut, issued at the same time that these Conder tokens were being made, has just 360 varieties. But in reality, the number of Conder tokens pales in comparison to another great British issue, which are the 17th century tokens, which have roughly 30,000 different varieties known. So before we move on to some ideas on how you can collect the Conder tokens, let's mention the standard reference work for the series. This is the Newman Portal, and I suspect that most of us here live by the adage of buy the book before the coin or token. I noted that the Conder token series was not only being collected as they were being issued, but books were being written on them almost as quickly. Most of these early works, including the one by James Conder, are very interested in historical documents, but not horribly useful to collectors today for attributing their tokens. The Bible for the series is the Dalton and Hamer book, The Provincial Token Coinage of the 18th Century. Now, a century old, in need of updating, but still the go-to work. There have been a half dozen reprints of this book in the last 50 years. This is one of the reprints. And this means that copies of the book can be found relatively inexpensively. Because it's out of copyright, there are also free PDFs available online, though these tend to be less useful since the scan quality of the photographs don't make them very suitable for attributing the tokens. And that's the main draw of the book, as nearly every token is illustrated. There are also some more specialized books dealing with smaller subsets of the whole series and a slew of important auction catalogs that contain valuable information. An hour talk can easily be given just on the reference works of these tokens, but many of these can be found listed on the Conder Club website, some of them available for free lending, while others can be found on the Newman Portal, especially those that are no longer in copyright. So let's turn now to why American collectors have long been charmed by the Conder token series. These were being actively collected by American collectors in the late 19th century. First, of course, is the shared language and the history of our moving from mostly British colonies to our own nation. It's true that many Americans are also a bit Anglophile in nature. The success of Agatha Christie's very British mystery series in the US for most of the last century is mirrored by the many American viewers of TV shows like Downton Abbey and The Crown in this century. The period that these tokens were issued, roughly from 1787 to 1799, a bit later for some pieces, especially in Ireland, is also one that fascinates collectors. That period overlaps the end of American colonial coinage, including the state coinage issues of Connecticut, Vermont, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and the Fugio coppers, all of which were being struck in America in 1787, the first year of the Conder series. But the period also extends into the early federal coinage of the Philadelphia Mint. There's also the fact that some of the things actively collected as part of the colonial American series are actually Conder tokens. The Kentucky token, the Franklin Press token, the various mules of the Talbot, Elm, and Lee series, the rare and very expensive, and several of the George Washington coins were all struck in England and are all listed by Dalton and Hamer as Conder tokens. Just a few years after Washington succeeded in wresting control of America away from the British Crown, These tokens were being made in England with his image on them, which is a mark of the respect the man had earned. The Thomas Paine pieces listed in the new edition of the Whitman Encyclopedia of Colonial and Early American Coins are Conder tokens as well, though most of these feature Paine swinging from the gallows, as he is here. Things like the Auctory Plebis token and the Washington North Wales halfpenny are also 18th century British-made token issues that were both earlier listed as evasion coppers, but should also be considered part of the Conder token series, along with the American Colonial series. The popularity of the Colonial series is also something interesting because they're very affordable. While mint state examples of colonial and early federal copper coins made in the US are rare and often quite expensive, mint state examples of Conder tokens are not difficult to come by. For some series, a brown unk can be had for $100 or less, while a blazing red unk, looking just as it did when it dropped from the press, might run as low as $250. This 1793 chain cent from the Pogue collection realized just shy of $1 million when it was sold 6 years ago. Whereas this Conder token, with the same 1793 date in the same grade, brought all of $150 at auction at the same time. Choice EF and AU tokens, which have all the detail and just slight wear, can often be had for $50 or less for most series. But Condors are not only affordable in terms of condition, but also in terms of rarity. The holy grail of Conder tokens is this amazing penny-sized piece issued by grocer Robert Orchard, and it features his bust in extremely high relief, so high that it extends well over the rims of the token and was a marvel of manufacture for the era. This token is equivalent to the 1913 Liberty nickel here in the US in many ways. There were 5 struck of each of these, all of which survive today. 2 of each of these are in museum collections, leaving just 3 specimens of each available for collectors to fight over. One of those 3 1913 Liberty nickels sold just a few weeks ago for $4.2 million. But this particular example of the Orchard token was sold at auction just 2 weeks earlier, realizing just under 15,000 British pounds, or about $17,000. Equal in rarity, equal in fame in their own country, yet vastly different in price. Most of us will never be able to afford a 1913 Liberty nickel, but many of us can actually be a player on those rare times that the Orchard token comes up for sale. Finally, the Conder series offer things that are seldom available in the colonial and early US coinage of the same era. There are error strikes, there are die trials, there are artist proofs, there are off-metal strikes, this one here in silver, and there are a wealth of collectible and unusual contemporary counterfeits. The series also offers a lot of interesting edge variations, different from American coinage, where there are just a handful of colonial issues and just a couple federal half and large cents that have edge variations. Okay, so let's move on to some of the different ways you can collect Conder tokens. I'll illustrate a few examples of each of these ways, but keep in mind that most of these suggested methods of collecting may have dozens, hundreds, or occasionally even thousands of different types of tokens that you can collect. And of course, many tokens can fit into more than one type of collection. So the easiest way to collect them is to try and collect them all. Well, easiest if you have a fair amount of money and an awful lot of time. A complete collection will never actually be possible. There are a number of unique varieties that are in different collections, including museum holdings, that will never be sold. But you can still form an extremely large collection. A couple collections of 6,000 or more varieties have already been formed, and putting together a collection of 4,000 or so tokens, roughly half of the existent varieties, can be done without stretching for the extreme rarities or more expensive pieces too very often. While there are a few outliers out there, most of the Condors fall into the penny, half penny, and farthing size. This denomination, featuring the Charles Rowe coinage, does come on all three sizes, though the farthing is here called a half penny, made specifically for collectors and not actually for circulation. Most of the other Conder tokens designs do only come in one denomination, though. But it's a way to collect. Do you love the larger canvas afforded by the penny size? Well, collect them. Are you charmed by the small diminutive farthing size? Collect those. The half pennies were the denomination most used in commerce, and far more than were struck than the other denominations. Focusing on those would be a huge collection, numbering well into the thousands, while the penny tokens have fewer and the farthings fewer still. An even smaller collection would be to pursue odd denomination tokens, which include a 3p, a shilling, 1 shilling and 1 penny, 1 shilling and 6p, and 2 shillings and 6p. And there are other unusual denominations along the way. Another way to collect is by country. All 4 countries comprising Great Britain had tokens issued. England with the most, Wales close, at least in tonnage, thanks to the Anglesey pieces, Ireland with fewer, and a large chunk of those being the KMAC issues we already saw, and Scotland with the fewest of all. If you have a family tie or love for one of these countries over the other, just pursue their tokens. Or you can focus on just 1 or 2 counties within those countries. Counties are similar to states in the US, and England, for instance, has 48 of them. Some counties have only a couple tokens listed. A few have just 1, others have none at all. But some counties have hundreds, or in the case of Middlesex, which includes Greater London, well over 1,000 different varieties. And of course, one could go down to the level of collecting just a single town or two. Though outside of larger cities like London and Birmingham, the number of tokens listed for individual towns rapidly decrease. Again, depending on how broad or deep you choose to focus your search, collecting this way can range from several hundred to several thousand individual tokens. One can collect only the genuine trade tokens that we first mentioned. Here are an example of some of them. Lackington was the most famous bookseller in the world at the time and had the largest stock. A haberdasher, another bookseller, and a factory. This group had a couple of very good books written on them, including one most recently by John Lusk, which illustrates all the types and offers several different ways you can pursue them. There are a few more, one from Ireland and one from Wales. Now, these tokens can be very well detailed like this, or frankly, kind of boring like this. They were all made to be used. This one was actually issued by Matthew Denton, a coin dealer. His piece has a charming obverse. The legend says, "We 3 blockheads be," and you might notice, well, there's only 2. You ask who the 3rd blockhead is, and it's you for asking. Depending on how far you want to collect this series, you can chase 200 to 250 or so individual types of tokens, or you can drill deeper and go after all the individual die varieties of all types, which would number well into the thousands. In contrast to pursuing these genuine trade tokens, one could instead go after only the general trade tokens, which are mentioned earlier. These pieces piggybacked on the genuine issues, looking kind of similar to them, but there's no name of an issuer or business at which to redeem them. In some cases, there might be a name in business that was actually made up, and good luck to any person trying to track down where to cash their tokens in. So as you can see, Chelsea halfpenny, doesn't say where. Aylesbury token, still not where. Payable in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, well, yeah, but where in those cities? Or more specifically, for general convenience, halfpenny token. Here are some more of these from Scotland, from Wales, and a farthing-sized token from Cambridgeshire, current in the counties. Well, yeah, current, but where are you going to cash them in? So it's likely that these various coiners made at least some of these tokens to sell in bulk to anyone who wanted them. This gave smaller businesses who could not afford to have their own dies cut and their own tokens struck a way to still acquire small change and the opportunity to make a profit on them, once they got them into circulation at least. These tokens were usually sold at 30 to 50% below their supposed halfpenny or farthing value, though of course they had far less copper than that in it. Depending on how one sets the boundaries for what they consider a general token to be, there'll be several hundred to several thousand examples to collect. Or you can become interested in one of the larger series of distinct types. The Anglesey Druid pieces that we mentioned, the KMAC pieces that we mentioned, and the John Wilkinson's. Each of these series are genuine trade tokens, but there are a large number of counterfeits of these types of tokens also known, and you can choose to pursue either or both as your interest warrants. Here's a counterfeit Anglesey. Notice the date 1784, 3 years before the coinage was actually struck, kind of a giveaway. Here's a counterfeit KMAC. Not only in brass, notice that the cipher here for the Hibernian Mine Company is upside down on the counterfeit. And here's a counterfeit of a John Wilkinson token. If pursuing only one of these single series, then you're more likely to do a deep dive into it and collect it all. Real and genuine, all the different edge varieties, off-metal strikes, errors, counterfeits, die trials, whatever else you can find. When going that deeply into a series, you can form a collection of hundreds of individual tokens. So while these larger token series have counterfeits, there are also counterfeit issues sprinkled throughout the Conder series, making for a very interesting subset to collect. Some of these counterfeit tokens were likely made by the same people who were also making the counterfeit British and Irish halfpence that we saw earlier, as well as evasion coppers of the same era. There will certainly be discoveries made with punch leakage to some of these other illicit coinages. These types of counterfeits are often, though not always, lightweight compared to the tokens they imitate. They often come with many different edge variations. They were likely not things made specifically for collectors, but rather to use up whatever leftover planchets they had on hand. Outside of the pieces struck on the steam presses of Matthew Bolton, the blank planchets of Conder tokens had the edge legend or design added to them prior to the tokens being struck. Counterfeits can be fairly well made like these, or extremely crude like these. They can either be collected on their own or along with the genuine issues they imitate. Some counterfeits, especially in the Irish KMAC and John Wilkinson series, have some wonderful misspellings in the legends, and that could form a collection all on their own, one that would surely irritate any English teacher. The reverse on this is supposed to read KMAC, Kyan, and KMAC. Here we have KNAC, Roan, and KNAC. Same thing, KMAC, Kian, and KMAC, starting with the C, ending with a K, starting with a K, ending with a C. Cover all your bases. John Wilkinson, here is John Wilkinson, missing the N. And here is John Wilkinson with an E instead of an I. Mules are well known to the hobby, and these are a pairing of two dies that were never meant to be used together. And the Conder Token series offers an amazing variety of them. Some were undoubtedly made for sale to collectors who vied with each other to own tokens that their friends lacked. And these made for collector mules usually exist in better grades. Here's an Anglesey obverse with a Thomas Spence reverse. Another Anglesey obverse with a different Spence reverse, this one showing Pandora's breeches. Or this one, a Lancaster, England obverse with an Irish KMAC reverse. Other mules were made by coiners to simply use up serviceable dies, or as the token coinage neared its end in the late 1790s, to strike any planchets with any dies that were still around and get them out into circulation. Usually this type of coins or this type of tokens come well used. So here's that lacking tin halfpenny obverse muled with an Irish halfpenny reverse. This is about as struck. This is all the detail that remained in the dies at this point. Here's that Irish halfpenny die muled with the reverse of the Washington Liberty and Security halfpenny, tying this to the American Colonial series. And here is a bizarre piece. The obverse of an evasion copper muled with the obverse of a Condor halfpenny struck on a planchet that's somewhere between those two sizes. Just bizarre. Interestingly, the term mule was actually known to collectors of the day, and it even found its way onto a token made by John Westwood that poked fun at collectors willing to pay handsome sums for such a thing. You never shall want my protection, be assured, friend mule. This wasn't Westwood's worst lampooning of collectors, though, as this token clearly shows asses running for halfpence, either biting commentary or biting the hand that feeds you. There are an extremely large number of tokens of an architectural nature, including not only pieces displaying the building a business may be in or a ruined castle that a town might be known for, but entire series made up solely of buildings, churches, gates, and other things made specifically for sale to collectors. Many of these are more medallic in nature with some exceptional die work. Many are also the larger penny-sized tokens, which offer a wealth of detail. So you have St. Paul's Cathedral, issued by coin dealer Henry Young, the Bank of England, the new brass works, St. Paul's Church at Covent Garden, which still stands before and after it was first destroyed by fire, some castle issues, the Dudley token, York Minster, and Clifford's Tower in Yorkshire. Some of these larger penny-sized building tokens also come with fascinating late die states with huge cuds on them, like the one seen here. Many of these, as we said, are more medallic in nature. You can also choose to collect that way and pursue only those pieces that seem to be more metal than token, though still listed in Dalton and Hamer. This type of collection would likely consist of higher grade pieces than some of the other ways to collect, since these special things were not struck specifically for circulation, though some, of course, did slip into commerce, were carried as pocket pieces, or otherwise mishandled in the last couple of centuries. There are literally hundreds of different more medallic varieties one can pursue. Many of these more medallic pieces also come in off metals, most often in silver, but also white metal, occasionally brass, lead, silvered, or gilt. There are other variations which were made for the collector's market. A few were even struck in gold, but it is thought that only one of those survives after a larger collection of them was stolen and presumably melted early in the 20th century. Off metals themselves make an interesting collecting area, and that's actually how I started collecting the Conder token series. Once you have, say, a white metal version of a token, then you should probably get a copper one as well. And as often happens, a collection soon overflows a single box, and you find you've gotten more immersed than you intended. Welcome to the club. One could also easily limit a collection to various themes that just interest you, which the Conder token series offer many of. You can collect tokens that only depict historical figures or animals. This was a two-headed cow that was actually alive and on display in London on the Strand in the building that now houses the Strand Hotel. You could collect tokens with ships or with horses or with dragons all on this single one. You can collect tokens that deal with tea, coffee, spices, or again with animals. You can collect tokens that deal with beer or wine. This lovely fellow has his own cask under his arm. You can collect tokens that deal with 18th century pursuits of entertainment, like ice skating or dressing up in funny uniforms. You can collect tokens from any number of businesses selling specific items needed for everyday living in 18th century England, including tobacco, fashionable shoes, umbrellas for the ever-present rain, riding gear, because of course you're going to hunt foxes, patent medicines, which often contained opiates or poisons like mercury or lead. Maybe after you visited some of your relatives in prison, you stop on the way home to buy some lottery tickets. And of course, you then indulge in the favorite British pastime, making fun of the French. There are usually dozens to hundreds of different types of tokens containing most of these themes. If you're interested in the American Colonial series, you can extend your collection to those pieces by adding in Conder tokens that directly link to them. This is the well-known tablet alum and Lee scent, struck in England for circulation in America. The obverse dies of the tablet alum and Lee were muled with various Conder token reverse dies and collected as part of the Conder series as well as the Colonial series. But you can then also add all the other Conder tokens that use these dies. This is the 1794 Talbot obverse paired with the 1795 dated Stork Promissory reverse, a double dated token. This Stork reverse also comes paired with this die, and with this die. One can collect dozens of tokens and dies that link to a single piece as a result. This is the same with edge varieties. Some of the ones found on the Talbot alum and Lees, the Kentucky tokens, and the early Washington pieces were also edges that were used on Conder tokens. And one can pursue a collection of those pieces with just those edges. A mostly inexpensive way to add variety to a colonial collection as well. This one generation removed collection would be fascinating, not require a great number of pieces, and few of them would run more than a couple $100 in grades from EF to UNC, far less than the pieces they link to that are now in the American Colonial series. This is an article I've been meaning to write for a decade or so, and maybe I'll get to it soon. There are also a larger number of politically themed tokens, from pieces professing God Save the King to those unhappy with the monarchy in a supposedly enlightened late age. Here you have a pig trampling on crowns, and here you have your king joined to the head of an ass. It was perhaps less good to be king when the politics of the day included things like slavery, the amassing of great wealth, or people arguing for equal rights and the vote. By far, the largest group of political tokens are those struck for Thomas Spence, seen here. Spence wanted equal rights, liberty, common ownership of land, free education, food for the poor, and many other things that benefited all of the country, not just those at the top. Spence's ideas found their way into the writings of Thomas Paine, and Paine's work certainly helped fuel the American Revolution. Spence, who was always in debt and sometimes in prison for his views, also wrote one of the earliest works on the Conder series and issued and sold a very large number of tokens expressing those same views. These became extremely popular with collectors of the day, which ironically, at that time, were mostly people of the social classes that Spence himself opposed. Spence tokens remains one of the most popular series of Condors today, thanks to his relevant social messages that echo down to the present time. but also in part because of his and his manufacturer Skidmore's penchant for mulling dies, striking the occasional off-metal pieces and producing a couple of very rare edge varieties as well. There are some examples of Spence tokens. The Tree of Liberty with the king's head perched on top. After the French Revolution, that symbolism was problematical. The End of Oppression with a bonfire. Protesting taxes and rents. Mocking a freeborn Englishman. Notice his hands are tied and his mouth is padlocked because you cannot speak ill of the king. One of the popular Spence pieces is this dog issue with the legend, "Much gratitude brings servitude." And the other side of that is the even more popular cat issue. "I, among slaves, enjoy my freedom." So there are, of course, as many ways to collect as there are people collecting, and I've only touched on a few examples here. There is no right or wrong way to pursue the Conder Token series, and any way that you do collect them is bound to bring you years of enjoyment, education, research, and even writing on them if you wish. So let me end this talk by thanking the Newman Numismatic Portal and noting that the first 75 odd issues of the Conder Token Collectors Journal are up on the portal for free. This is all but the 6 most recent issues. That's the incentive to join the club, since you'll then have the most current information. The club website is here, and members can access all back issues of the journal, as well as other information, including links to dealers, a list of books in the club library, and even some talks on the series, which will soon include this one. You can easily pay your dues online, and we're happy to offer both a very reduced cost digital membership as low as $10 for 3 journals, an even cheaper option for young numismatists of just $5 for 3 journals, which is about a year and a half at the current rate of publication. We also hope to have even more incentives for young numismatists to join the club and undertake research. And we're actively exploring ways to bring this 18th century token coinage into the 21st century. Hopefully some of you watching will get intrigued by this series and join us for the ride. So thank you for your time and interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All righty, awesome. I'll have you go ahead and stop your screen share. There's a red button at the top there. Should say stop share. There we go. And okay, so we already have quite a few questions in the Q&A, but if you do have them, you can go ahead and send those in and we'll be working our way down. So let's see, we have until 4 o'clock. Let's see what we get through.
Okay.
All righty. Do you have any ideas to get US collectors more interested in condors? Comparable US tokens fetch thousands versus the very low levels of these. A recent auction in the UK showed strong prices. Could this be due to grading? A few questions in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're actively looking for ways to interest people. We have the same problem in Conder tokens that we have in a lot of numismatics. Is the average age of collectors is somewhere between gray hair and Social Security, probably. And we're not doing a good job of reaching younger people. So you're the exception here, and we thank you for doing this, but we do need to reach more. And it's also an issue of supply and demand. So right now the demand might be a little bit lower than it was, say, 10 years ago for Conder tokens specifically. The supply has actually gone up as some of these larger collections have been sold. The inventory of a major British dealer that had tens of thousands of tokens has been sold over the last few years. So those kind of come interplay for pricing in themselves. But talks like this, hopefully articles in the mainstream numismatic press, like Coin World or the Numismatist, which just had an issue with a Conder token article in it, increases interest more. And for whoever asked that question, if you have ideas, please run with them. all of numismatics will thank you.
Sounds good. All righty. Could tokens from one merchant be redeemed elsewhere with other merchants? I would think the copper itself would have value regardless of the actual issuer.
Well, the outside of the Anglesey pieces, which had their full weight in copper, the other ones had roughly about what you would find in an English coin at the time. So its copper value of a halfpence may have been closer to a farthing, and a farthing would have been, close to half of a farthing's copper value. So other merchants weren't likely to take the tokens in at full face value. There may have been some sort of clearinghouses that collected these types of tokens, and when they had a big enough batch, sent them in. We really don't know a lot about how they were redeemed because a lot of those records just never survived. Most of these businesses closed eventually. Most closed, before the end of the 18th century, and whatever records they have would have disappeared. But for the ones that we know what the mintage figures are and the number that survive today, it seems like 90, 95, 98% may have been redeemed. So there was some sort of process of doing it, and yeah.
Alrighty. So how many of the 10,000 do you have?
I early on I thought I'm going to be one of those people who do it all, but unlike Scrooge McDuck, I don't have a vault full of money. So I've probably got about 5,000 or so now, but I'm trying to find a way to focus my collection smaller. And I tend to like the larger series, which to me are more American in nature. So you have die varieties, and sometimes the die varieties are, the period is this much further this way, which is exactly what the die varieties are on a lot of colonial coins. So to an American mindset, that's what we're used to. That fascinates me. The Brits don't really care about that as much. So as I find a way to figure out what the parameters of my own collection are, it'll probably reduce in size, but I'm going to enjoy whatever I do have.
Let's see, somewhat related here. With so many varieties having been produced, do any of the dies exist? If so, are there enough to form a collection?
Off the top of my head, I don't think any dies have stayed in existence, because these were all made in England or Ireland. If dies were still around, they would be there. So there may be some in like some historical society or a museum holding or something. Matthew Bolton's dies at the Soho Mint, bunches of those were sold as the mint eventually closed in the 19th century. So there may have been some in there. I don't think, I went to the Soho Mint site years ago, and I don't think there was any die left in their museum, but there might be. The dies would also be 225 plus years old, so probably not in the best condition today, and would certainly not be usable for striking. But it would be interesting to see. So I don't know for sure, but
something to look into.
Yeah, and a good article if somebody wants to run with that. And
there you go. How did you take the photos for the seminar? So many different types, yet your lighting is consistent and excellent. Any quick tips?
Oh, well, actually, I wrote an article on photographing Conder tokens, and kind of the same article for photographing colonial coins. The Conder token one was in our Conder Token Club journal, and the one on colonials was in the C4 newsletter. Both of those are up for free on the Newman Portal. So it's a two-part article. It's long, but tons of tips in there. So literally, I have a very old digital camera and a ledge that I can put coins on and do it in daylight. That's it. No special equipment.
There you go.
And there's free editing software too that I talk about in that article. Download it for free. Has everything you need, including the best invention ever, a circle crop. So you can do the edge of the token perfectly.
I do. What criteria does copyright use for including certain D&H listed tokens as evasions?
Okay, we're getting into the specialist side and not the introductory side. So Copyright wrote a book on evasion coppers called, what was it called? Searching for the spiny fubbaduck in the Monolochian rainforest. I mean, you know you're in for something fun there. The evasion series was likely made by some of the people who are making the Conder tokens, mostly William Lubitsch in Birmingham that we mentioned early on. Evasions imitate British and Irish coinage in that there's a bust on one side and a seated figure or a harp on the other side, but the legends around, instead of saying, Georges the Third Rex, might say Ganges third rate, or some jumble of letters that kind of look close enough at first glance, and maybe if you were illiterate, you're like, yeah, it kind of looks right. And it was thought, though we don't know for sure, it was thought that the legends were different to evade the law on counterfeiting, because the law was it had to be an absolute imitation to be considered a counterfeit. And you could claim, no, this wasn't an imitation. This, I mean, come on, who's going to take a coin that says, Gulliamus Shakespeare as a coin? So Copyright wrote a booklet on these, and he included some Conder tokens. And usually the criteria for it was if that Conder token used a known die that was paired with evasion coppers. So there's early on, I showed the Washington North Wales halfpenny. So that North Wales reverse, or one similar to it, was used with one of the John Wilkinson Ironmaster obverses. So he considered that an evasion copper. It's actually in both series. It is a Conder token. It is an evasion copper. The George Washington North Wales is in 3 series. It's those 2 plus American colonial coins.
Alrighty. Please explain the meaning of Pandora's breeches.
That one I knew and I forgot, so I'm gonna pass on that. I believe it had something to do with Guy Fawkes burning down Parliament, or setting the explosives in Parliament, and somebody's breeches caught fire. Oh, somebody may correct me on this one. I'll Google it after we're done, which will be too late to answer the question. But it is an interesting design. There's actually 2 dies with that design on it, so it was something that was known in contemporary mindset at the time.
Okay, if anyone is familiar with Pandora's breeches, you're welcome to send that in the Q&A, and I will
Please
share
do, yes.
whatever you tell us. In the meantime, is there a registry set for these?
I don't think there is one yet. I believe only NGC is grading tokens at this time. I will say probably 99% of British collectors do not want their tokens in slabs. So they have no interest in participating in this little game. Most American collectors don't want their tokens in slabs. And one reason for this is these tokens have edge varieties. And if they're in slabs, you can't really see them too well. And these tokens have survived just fine. Those full mint red ones that are a couple $100, they've been full mint red for 220 odd years, not being in slabs. So, they don't need them for the protection. They don't need them for anything else. The attributions on slabs is hit or miss. I've seen far more wrong than I've seen correct ones. The grading, same commentary there. And then you think about the storage size. So, if you're only going to have a collection of 50 or 100 tokens, that might be, 10 boxes or 5 to 10 of the PCGS boxes. If you have 2,000 tokens and you can only get 20 in a box, now you're talking 100 boxes, whereas a standard double row box and cotton envelope or cotton holders in a paper envelope, you can get 200 tokens in a box. So for those reasons, the slabbing is not as popular for this particular series.
Where can I find information on letter type and/or letter punches used for the tokens?
Well, easy answer is you can't. It hasn't been done yet. There's so much left to research on this series, and I mean, frankly, across all of numismatics. The advent of digital photography and better photographs means you can actually start taking pictures of individual letter punches. And I would love to see some sort of database of this formed. And at some point, with the advent of machine learning and AI and all of these wonderful things that fascinate us and scare us at the same time, if you have like a file with 8,000 photographs of the letter R, our eyes aren't going to be able to do it too well, but machine learning can zip through that file in like 4 seconds and let us know which ones match, which are the same punches, which are different, maybe forming into different groups. And that's going to be really valuable, as I said, for the die linkage with evasion coppers, with counterfeits. If we can find, the same letter punch was used in 4 different series on 87 different tokens and 12 counterfeits, you kind of get an idea that they were probably made by the same person at the same mint, roughly the same time. But it's not done yet. So, start working.
This is your invitation to write the article.
Exactly. Whoever asks the question has to do the work. So that's the rule.
All right, we do have a little more information on Pandora's breaches. Apparently it relates to Joseph Priestley.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
And the same person shared that PCGS does have a limited registry set
they do.
Conder tokens. So.
Okay. I will say probably the 3 finest condition collections of Conder tokens that I know of, they refuse to slab their tokens. So, you take your registry set with a big grain of salt. It may be the finest certified, but there may be 600 out there that haven't been certified. So don't pay a huge premium for finest known. Not at this point.
Okay, I scrolled down. We have another comment about Pandora's breaches. We're going to clear this up somehow. Okay, I believe the story behind Pandora's breaches was that a pair of breaches were found in the House of Commons in the late 18th century that were somehow rigged to set the house on fire.
Yeah.
The Pandora element was that all the problems experienced, i.e. the American Revolution, came from the opening of a Pandora's box.
Okay. That sounds vaguely familiar with the Guy Fawkes burning Parliament thing. So who knows? And guess what? A great article to write. Submit it to the Conder Token Collectors Journal. We'll publish it. I'll give you photographs to use for it.
That'll be great. All righty. Without considering varieties, how many Conder tokens are there? I'm guessing they mean like major types as opposed to die varieties. I'm guessing that's what we're going for there.
Ooh, well, significantly less than the 9,000, obviously. I honestly, I don't think I've ever looked at it that way. And it would depend on how you broke down types. So, like the Anglesey Druids is a 1788 reverse a different type that looks exactly the same as the 1787, except for the date.
Right.
It is a period at the end of the legend, a different type from one that doesn't. But just saying, like major design types, there's probably a couple thousand individual varieties, and a lot of the die varieties are just 1 or 2 varieties of that type. The larger series have significantly more varieties.
Okay. Let's see. Of the Middlesex can't read, of the Middlesex Hackney Rebello penny being at a low population of 28 in copper, how many of the restrikes exist, and when were they produced from the corroded dies?
Wow, we're getting advanced. Okay, so much for introduction. I have no idea. It's not a piece I own in my collection, even though I've passed on a few of them. To me, it's not really a Conder token. It was a token made to honor a numismatist who had passed away. That information, I am almost certain, exists in the literature. There was the British firm of Baldwin's had auctioned their inventory as a group of basement sales, and there were 3 auctions that had that. And I believe there were silver and coppers and copper original, copper restrikes in those sales. And the cataloger who did that knows his stuff, and I'm sure that information was in there. So not in my brain, but a very quick Google search away, I'm sure.
Do you have any information on engravers or die sinkers?
There's an excellent book. It was done by David Dykes, D-Y-K-E-S, and he's got a lot of information on die engravers and sinkers. A lot of it we don't know. A lot of them would have been journeyman artisans, but for the pieces that we do know, early on when I said, these were produced by Westwood and these were by Hancock and these were by Bolton, that information survived because there were contemporary collectors who were getting these tokens and collecting that information. So one of them was Charles Pye, who also issued a token himself, and he wrote directories, kind of like the equivalent of the phone book. Not that that exists anymore, but a directory of people in his town. And his town was Birmingham, and Birmingham was the epicenter of the token industry as well as the counterfeiting industry at the time. So he knew all these people, and he would be able to go and visit them, and they could say, oh, so and so cut these dies, and I struck 37 of them, and that information was recorded. So we do have a fair amount of information. The Baldwin sales that I mentioned, the first 2, I believe, or maybe all 3 of the basement ones, actually ordered their tokens by issuer, and that contains some information on engravers as well, specifically the ones that the engravers struck for their own benefit and not for a customer. So there's information out there, but again, there's going to be a lot more found, I'm sure. And one of the things the Newman Portal is doing, of course, is scanning as much as can possibly be scanned. I've put them in touch with the Royal Mint Museum in Wales that has a wonderful collection of 18th century literature that was the library of Miss Banks, who I did a talk on last year on her American coins. And getting some of that information out there that we can all easily have at our fingertips online is really going to change things. And I think as more smaller museums and historical societies and libraries do the same thing, we're going to discover more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, final comment on Pandora's breaches. There's apparently an article about it in the Asylum from August 22nd of 2021.
Oh, that's living memory. We should remember that.
If anyone wants to go searching for it, I know the Asylum is entirely archived on the NNP. So if you search Pandora's breaches on the NNP, I'm guessing that'll come up.
There we go.
So thank you to the person who contributed that. Let's see. What's your personal favorite Conder token? If all of them were falling out of an airplane, which one would you save?
Ooh, that's like picking your favorite kid, I mean, you probably have one day, and then it switches the next day, and then you hate them all the day after that. So, gosh, I don't think I could think of one, because my interest started with the off metals, and then I collect counterfeit British and Irish of the 18th century. So I'm really fascinated with the counterfeit Conder tokens because they do tie together. So I would probably pick a counterfeit, but you know, after your collection reaches a certain point, you look through it and you'd have to save them all. You find a way to pilot that plane, land it safely, and walk away with all your tokens.
There you go. Was there a relationship between Josiah Wedgwood and the makers of the Am I Not a Brother, Am I Not a Man and a Brother Conder tokens?
Again, don't know. Might be out there in the literature. I do collect some of those, generally the off metal, the white metal, and the brass and gilt pieces. Wedgwood, of course, made the pottery that we're all familiar with, the blue Wedgwood pottery. And there is a round one with that exact same kneeling slave, and you know, with the chains, with the same legend. So we don't know, did he copy the tokens? Did the token copy him? Was the image used in anti-slavery societies before either? And these were both derivative of that. I'm sure there are people out there who know the answer, and you know, if you do, type it in.
We'll read it out. Let's see, who is Mr. B?
Mr. B. Okay, so we're well past the intro stage. So a number of tokens, not a huge number, probably somewhere in the dozens, have a, if you can see the space between my fingers, the letter B, that big, counter stamped on the token. And it's sometimes fairly well hidden, sometimes in the field, but it's so small that unless you were literally looking at that particular spot with a magnifying glass, your eyes would probably go over it. And we have no idea who Mr. or Miss, because there was Miss Banks, but we know it's not her because her condors are in the British Museum. But we don't know who the B is. It was a collector because like 90% of the ones that are known are on very rare tokens. And, you know, whoever this was, pride of ownership. So, you know, we also know, discovered a century after it was done, that one of the 1804 dollars has the little letter D punched in the clouds for one of its earlier collectors. So this was a practice that was known, not recommended to do today to your coins. Not sure if it would slab if it's counter stamped or not. You know, that might be graffiti or environmental damage or whatever they want to term it, but we don't know. So there's you know, there's any number of collectors whose name started with a B, Miss Banks being one of them, but we've never been able to track the actual tokens to known auctions of collections. So they are out there. And oddly enough, they bring a premium when they come up for sale, even though you almost needed a scanning electron microscope to see it sometimes. If it's there, it adds value to the token. So, and again, great idea for research. Figure it out, write an article, we'll publish it.
Very interesting. Are other counter stamps common on these tokens?
They're not common, but they're not ridiculously rare either. I was going to include a slide for that as a way to collect of, you know, all the things that happen to a token after it was struck. So it could be counter stamped, it could be made into a gear, it could be holed and worn for jewelry. I mean, there's anything that you could do with a coin, you could obviously do with one of these. There are random letter counter stamps, which are, yeah, fairly common. And by random letter, it's like, you know, IG. Well, you're never going to figure out who IG is. You know, it just, good luck on that. You know, you could say anything, and no one's going to prove you wrong or right. There are some evasions or some Conder tokens that are counterstamped by Thomas Spence, who was that last slide we showed that he issued all those political tokens. And one of his many times in bankruptcy, out of jail, he sold the dies. And he sold the dies to the Skidmores in London, who made all these weird mules and everything else. And we think that maybe with the money, or whatever money he had left over from those dies, he had punches made. And some of those punches were usually single word punches, or maybe 2-word punches. And you could combine them in any number of ways and counterstamp coins and tokens. The counterstamps might read, no landlords, full bellies, you fools, Spence's plan forever. And there's literally hundreds of different combinations of these out there, although each individual one is quite rare. There's a critical mass of them out there. Some of those on Conder tokens. And there's a few others, there's a few merchant counterstamps, things that have circulated much later. In my collection, I have one of those Irish KMAC tokens that I illustrated earlier on, the seated figure in the HMC cipher, and it's counterstamped Devons and Bolton for circulation in Canada in the 1840s. So these things went all over the place. We don't know why, why an Irish Conder ended up in North America, but it was in circulation. So they're long answer, yes, there are other counterstamps, ranging from to very interesting. So,
alrighty, and to balance out all the complicated questions, we have a much simpler one. I missed the first few minutes. Can you repeat why these are called Conder tokens?
Yes, so James Conder wrote an early book on them, and his wasn't the first book, his wasn't the best book. Somehow the name stuck, and we don't know why. They're so-called 18th century provincial tokens, mostly in the UK, which is the accurate term for them. Even though they don't cover the entire 18th century, they just basically go for the last 13 years of the 18th century. So James Conder's name somehow got associated with it in the US, and it's stuck, and it's there. So we're not tilting at windmills trying to get rid of it anymore.
Alrighty, we're back to specialized questions. Okay. If I'm not mistaken, some of these have been found in archaeological contexts in North America. Some of the cruder counterfeits you showed resembled the blacksmith tokens of Canada from the 1830s. Could some of the counterfeits have been created in the 1830s in Canada due to their earlier circulation and thus recognizability in that area?
Okay, so the question really isn't about Conder tokens. So it's about the counterfeit British halfpence that I showed early on.
I believe so.
As a result of there not being enough regal copper. So yes, the Canadian blacksmith tokens absolutely mimic the earlier British and to a lesser extent Irish halfpenny counterfeits that would have been in circulation. The true blacksmith tokens don't have legends on either side. So it's got the bust usually facing the wrong way, a seated figure facing the wrong way, but no legend to tie it to any specific country or anything really. Could they have been made in Canada? Probably not too early. I don't think there's any evidence for any coining press in Canada prior to about 1830, 1840, I think was the first that people have been able to locate one. And the Canadian blacksmith tokens, they're meant to look crude, but they're very well made. They're all the exact same diameter. They're all the exact same thickness. They're all perfectly round. I'm talking about the wood 1 through 18 series, which is what we generally consider to be the true blacksmiths. They weren't struck by a blacksmith on an anvil. There's no way you can get that level of consistency. They were made by somebody who knew what they were doing, and they were crappy looking dies, but they were meant to look crappy. So Yeah, the answer is, again, we don't know. There were some British and Irish counterfeits that were almost certainly made in the US. They could have been made anywhere from, the date they bear to, maybe on up into the very early 19th century. At some point, there would have been enough copper in circulation from the Philadelphia Mint that these wouldn't have circulated here. The ones that were in the United States could have taken the short trip up to Canada and circulated there until they got more coinage of their own. So it's we're still really at the beginnings of trying to figure a lot of this stuff out. And I mean, frankly, that's exciting. I always cast aspersions on series like Morgan Dollars, which I find boring, because we know everything about them, or we know just about everything about them. You might find a new dye variety, and that's exciting, but you know all the history, you know who made them, you know where they were made and when they were made and how many were made. We know none of that for this stuff. So you're literally at the cutting edge of research if you choose to pursue these, to me, far more interesting and far less expensive ways to collect.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I'm going to have to cut us off there because we are coming right up on 4 o'clock.
Okay.
So for anyone in the audience, if you have further questions, you're welcome to go to the symposium website, to that contact us page, and send it in. And then I'll forward it along to Jeff so you can get in touch that way. So feel free to do that. In the meantime, thank you everyone for watching. We had a great audience for this one. And thank you, Jeff, for a very interesting presentation. I think we all have learned a lot. And for audience members, our next presentation is starting in about 4 minutes. We have a Q&A with John Albanese about the new CAC grading service. So that one should be exciting as well. And I think that's all I have. Jeff, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just thank you all for listening, and thank you to the Newman Portal for hosting this. It's always been a lot of fun to watch and to do.
Alrighty, awesome. Well, hope to see some familiar names in later sessions. We are going all the way through Saturday, so we have quite a few left throughout the weekend. Have a good evening.